we all know that housing shortages limit affordability, availability, and the chance to build equity and prosperity, and it really changes how people's opportunities fall. But Microsoft and the study last year showed that King County alone had a gap of over 300,000 units to fill the affordable housing gap that we have. That's just one county in one state, like right here, the whole country. And the whole country has the housing affordability crisis that's spreading throughout. And as people live longer and millennials seek houses, it creates a lot of problems it creates a lot of problems that end up spreading, not just through a local jurisdiction or not just through a region, but as people move to change their lifestyle in retirement, or they change to move to a new job, which is what we see here in Washington. But the answer to all these problems is really simple, right? The really simple answer is build more houses, right? That sounds really simple. But the problem is, in practice, that gets really complicated, and it gets complicated really quickly. Because one, every home builder in the country is flat out. For a variety of reasons, they can't build any faster than they can. And there's a lot of reasons why that's the case. But while that's a problem, we come back to technology and how it can help solve the problem, because advances in materials and building technology and techniques, as well as different planning and regulatory changes, can increase housing supply, meaning that we can build more homes faster. That is, if we can implement all of those changes and all the technological advances at a sufficient scale to make a difference. So here to explore where some of these advances in construction technology can take us, I'd like to invite our next panel, Don Brunel of Node, who is a developer of prefabricated homes that include the latest technology, functionality, and efficiencies in terms of construction. Ryan Kolker of the International Code Council, the association that provides sort of a worldwide model for how codes and construction should operate. Molly Fadul of Katerra, a company that's using innovative solutions to improve affordability by driving down costs and the time to construct. And Greg Howes, a partner and co-founder of CutMyTimber, as well as the co-founder of the AEC Hackathon. And moderating our discussion will be Dan McFeeters of Fannie Mae, whose job includes finding ways to finance affordable single-family housing and promote affordable housing production. I'd like you to give our panel a warm welcome, please.
Thank you. Thank you, James. And before we get started, a quick thanks to the University of Washington for co-sponsoring this event with us. As James laid out in his background, there's a tremendous amount of innovation that's happening in the construction space and in the home building space in particular that has a tremendous amount of progress to improve cost efficiencies, improve energy efficiency, resiliency, and the speed at which you're able to deliver homes, new homes to the market. There's also a lot of uncertainty remaining, particularly as to the question of whether and how these innovations will actually fundamentally change the way that we deliver affordable housing in America. And so to help start exploring this issue, I want to turn it to our panelists really quickly to talk a little bit about their organization, how they're working on this issue, and what innovation in particular excites them the most.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I work as a partner at CutMyTimber. We have a factory in Portland, Oregon, where we use computer-aided manufacturing and literally robots to prefabricate wooden structures. My partner is a Swiss immigrant. I would qualify the German and Swiss wood building industry is generally more technically advanced than where we are in the US. The machines are robots, and CNC machines are all from Europe. We've done a few hundred buildings, everything from large commercial structures for Nike, Adidas, Google, to a lot of single-family residential units. And our objective is essentially to use the best processes to build using wood. The other thing we're doing is the AEC hackathons. Those are architecture, engineering, and construction. We started those events to bring together the tech industry with the digitally savvy builders. And we've had 41 of those, including 3 at the University of Washington. The next one is in Shanghai. That'll be the 3rd time. in 10 different countries. We organize those as volunteer events simply to promote innovation.
Hi, I'm Molly Fadul with Katerra. Katerra is a construction technology startup. I don't know if we can really call it a startup, but we technically are. Started in 2016, now have 8,500 employees across the globe, have acquired over 20 businesses in the last 2 years, and are taking on using technology in construction in many ways. So that's anywhere from automation in factories to deliver panels of buildings offsite that are manufactured in a factory, as well as cross-laminated timber. Similar to what Greg does, we have the largest CLT factory that just opened up in Spokane, Washington. So we'll be doing mass timber buildings and sourcing and selling materials from there. We're also working on various aspects of technology to apply to building systems. And our goal is to bring costs down, to source materials cheaper, and to be able to find more efficient ways to build housing.
So the International Code Council is probably best known for the development of model building codes, which are adopted at a state and local level. But we also offer a variety of different solutions to support communities in delivering safe and resilient buildings and a broader community as well. So whether that's through things like product evaluations, accreditation services, benchmarking resources, those sorts of tools to really help move the market forward while assuring that we're building the best possible buildings for communities. The area that really excites me the most is the offsite construction piece. It just addresses a lot of the challenges that we're seeing within the broader industry. So certainly affordability, but also picking up sustainability, some workforce challenges that need to be addressed. And so really moving forward in that space is certainly very exciting.
So I'm Don Bonnell. I'm one of the co-founders at Node. We are a Seattle-based housing technology startup, a little bit smaller than Katerra. I haven't raised quite as much money as the folks over at Katerra, but we have raised some money and have a production facility down in Soto. And what we are fundamentally doing is developing a flat pack system for housing. And I think what's unique about what we're doing is we're really trying to engineer all the components so they go together really quickly and really easily. So it's about making home building much, much more efficient and faster. But I think kind of the key innovation and insight on our part is that we want to bring a new workforce to bear on housing. The way residential construction is done today is primarily around using subcontractors. We have 1 million fewer construction workers today than we did 10 years ago. It's an aging workforce. If we can change the way that we build, then we can bring new people into building homes. So that's fundamentally what we're trying to do.
And so, Molly, starting with you, a lot of these innovations seem to run the gamut between supply chain optimization to labor force mobilization. I guess, can you talk a little bit about what is it about this time and this generation of technologies that's causing this to be viewed as a transformative moment? And what's the value proposition behind that?
So I think there's a lot of factors that have taken place over the last 20 years that have gotten us to the point where right now you're seeing a lot of innovation coming into the space. I think the main being that you've seen productivity gains across all industries except construction. And so people are starting to pay attention to that. Beyond that, I think the ability to collect and use data through cloud computing is allowing construction startups to actually be able to make an impact quickly. And so instead of, in the past, highly capital-intensive business, there are folks that have been able to start businesses on with smaller amounts of capital and have been able to work towards innovation using advanced calculations through cloud computing. And that's, I think, been a big piece that's allowed for innovation to happen across numerous levels instead of just the largest companies with the most amount of capital trying to innovate. Obviously, Katerra's raised a lot of money. We're going after a lot of those spaces, but I think that's been a key piece that's led to some of the capital going into the space, and you're seeing a lot of money now being invested in the space. It's more than we've ever seen, and that, to me, is a sign that we're ripe for disruption, and there's a lot of good things happening in the space.
So for Don and Greg, if you guys are thinking about it from the other side of the supply chain, producing something to then ship out, do those efficiencies scale in distributed construction sites where you may not have full control over the workforce or over how things are fundamentally assembled?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at scale. And I think we have seen waves of innovation in kind of prefab housing over the last 20 or 30 years in the US. And I think one of the problems we have is housing by nature is cyclical. So we've had housing startups, most of them in what I would think is kind of big volumetric modular, where you're building the big box in the factory, putting on a wide load truck and moving it to site. And those companies start to get traction because it's a capital intensive proposition to do those things, right? And then you have a housing downturn. So when you've got a housing downturn and you've got a bunch of permanent employees in a factory and you're holding all these capital assets, that's a tough place to be as a company. So we think really hard about that. My co-founder, Beck Chapin, was with a modular, kind of a volumetric modular building company before that. So we bring a lot of that into the kind of history of modular building into kind of the way we think about it. So the way we come at it is really from a pretty fundamental and simplistic viewpoint, and is to try to stay as capital efficient as possible, always asking ourselves, do we need to own that asset? Is there somebody else that can make that component for us? So we do have some manufacturing capacity, but to the extent possible, we try to leverage the supply chain so we don't have to hold a lot of capital assets so we can get through a downturn when it does inevitably happen. And then part two of that is the workforce. So trying to stay lean on the workforce and think about a different way to bring workers into building homes.
Ed, do you have a different view on any of that?
I don't have a different view. I think there's actually room for thousands of companies in let's call it the prefab supply chain. And there's different models you can do. Use the vertically integrated model, or you can also just build out your supply chain partners so you're solving part of the problem, and then maybe that's informal vertical integration. But you do need, I think, to identify the partners who are also very digital and willing to look at new processes. A lot of the industry isn't, but I think you can carve out a niche where you're introducing some levels of efficiency and then grow through partnerships, and that's essentially what we're trying to help do.
Ryan, what's the role for standards bodies and governing bodies throughout this process, especially as things move ever so quickly into the digital space?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly an opportunity within the codes and standards space to actually support scalability and predictability. A lot of folks would look at codes as barriers, but when you're looking to move an entire marketplace forward, having standards in place that can support predictability, for folks that are entering, with new technologies to be able to support advancements, having a predictable model across various different jurisdictions is certainly a huge benefit. One area that we're particularly focused on is the offsite construction space through identifying and bringing together standards on both the design and construction side, but also on the planning, permitting, and inspection piece, which has been sort of a huge challenge for getting folks engaged in the market, of not really understanding sort of how something that's built maybe 100 miles away from the jurisdiction where it's going to sit, and what is the process to actually make that happen. And then also looking at things like product evaluations for new technologies that are not specifically named within codes, but meet the intent of the code. And so how can you get into the marketplace quicker, and how can building code inspectors really trust the efficacy of new products and technologies?
So for the rest of the panel, what's the practical effect of folks like the council moving in that direction, trying to standardize things, and what additional steps do you need them to take in order to do what you're trying to do?
I think anyone that's been in the real estate space understands how challenging it can be working within or with various jurisdictions. There's different codes, different rules, different folks that you're in contact with, different processes if you're offsite versus if you're doing offsite construction versus onsite, and you end up actually splitting the inspections between two different groups, and folks that haven't done that before aren't necessarily as comfortable with it, and it can lead to a lot of delays and challenges. And so, if there could be uniformity around some of those things and working with jurisdictions and municipalities to find uniformity, it would be a huge benefit to our industry.
Yeah, I agree, absolutely. I mean, just to work within I've been a licensed builder here for over 20 years, even dealing with municipalities in the greater Seattle area. Building is becoming more complex, the regulatory environment, and so it can be overwhelming, just the resources you have to put to understand how to build in that particular municipality. So any standardization is really welcome, and that standardization making it easily to understand the regulatory environment in that specific municipality. just reduce that friction would really help.
Yep, it's, I mean, we grapple with a couple of these things. So we do a combination of in-factory inspections and on-site inspections, and that's hard. It is really hard to have to kind of play in both those worlds. And yeah, but what's the biggest thing we could do is like, it's so frustrating to deal with different building codes everywhere we go. And even in Washington, right now we're only delivering to Western Washington, and there's tons of different codes we have to think about just in Western Washington. So some uniformity around codes would be super helpful.
Sticking with this topic for a second, Ryan, how do you manage that as the supply chains get longer and longer and you're exposed to America's highway system in trying to transport materials from point A to point B? Does that necessitate more factories, or can you create processes and standards that stand up to the rigors of shipping things across country?
Yeah, I mean, certainly that's definitely a consideration, but leave it to innovators within the industry to figure out sort of the best strategies to address all of those particular challenges, supply chain needs. But really, at the end of the day, it's providing performance for home builders, homeowners, and that community in particular. So, I think just sort of laying out what are the expectations from the offsite construction industry and the building industry in general is really the way to sort of move things forward, provide a level playing field, make sure that we're not building one type of housing for, say, an affordable housing project while having different criteria for sort of other types of buildings.
Molly, Greg, does that issue, dealing with the realities of shipping things, how does that factor into the way you manage your supply chains today?
It's a really big issue. I mean, I think it's beneficial to focus locally. So you're not shipping as far. Your risk goes up with distance. For example, bringing in product from Europe. You're really multiplying the risk. Plus, those suppliers are less familiar with our regulatory environment. We're primarily focused in the Pacific Northwest. That's enough complexity to deal with. And so we try to purchase and produce locally. And ultimately, you're working with partners who want to build in these new, very digital ways. And identifying the right partners who choose to do that, I think, is critical. And then you can scale new processes with partners as a way to scale, as opposed to going through the learning curve with people that are distant and who are unfamiliar with offsite manufacturing.
I think from Katerra's perspective, there's a large benefit that we found in mass purchasing and sourcing. And so that is somewhat offset some of the logistical costs, but that's always a concern. We price every project based on how far it is from our factory. And the cost of logistics is a factor, but we think that the efficiencies that we find by producing in the factory are larger than those logistical costs.
So Don, when we were talking a bit last night, we analogized, and even some on the prep call, we analogized the sort of move to offsite production to what the car companies did about a century ago. Yep. We've heard over and over in some remarks today about the importance of scale. You mentioned a bit yourself a little bit earlier. What is that breakthrough number? What gets this to a sustainable level where you're producing enough, where all of the promise of these new technologies are being realized?
Well, that's a tough question. The way we think about it is once we get to a few hundred homes a year, it's enough for us to feel like we're making a big impact in the market, and the economics work for us really well at that point. So it's not a huge number of homes, and I think so much of that has to do with just the inefficiency of the system. We're not the bar for getting to scale and profitability is actually pretty low in this industry because we're dealing with an inherently inefficient industry. So for us, it's I can't answer that for other folks on the panel, but for us, it's a fairly low number.
Molly?
I mean, obviously, Katerra's invested a significant amount of money building large factories, and so obviously, volume is important, and Katerra's looking to grow not only in this market but all over the world, and so scale is incredibly important to being able to, be where Katerra wants to be as a low cost, high quality provider of offsite construction.
Factories and machines and the people are really capital intensive, so they're A lot of companies aren't in a position essentially to finance it. And there's so much risk involved in the cyclical industry. We're small. We're essentially self-financing. We'd like to grow faster for that. Of course, we need more capital. There are efficiencies that come in with scale. Love to get there. And I think our approach is to do that with partners who also want to scale because we're not completely vertically integrated. I do think Western Washington, Pacific Northwest, again, there's room for thousands of companies, and the objective is how do we develop scalable building systems in this region, and shouldn't we be the best in the world at using technology to build wood frame structures? We have the most wood, so how do we identify those best tools, and how do we help create that supply chain?
So Ryan, for the builders, for the financiers, for the insurance companies, what's the best way to think about their strategy for engaging with the council or the various local regulators, either in Washington or Orlando or anywhere in between, when you're thinking about ramping up to the kind of numbers that Kimberly was talking about, 1.9 million homes potentially per year?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple opportunities. The code development process at a national level is an open consensus-based process, and so as innovators or folks within the industry identify solutions, proposing those to incorporate into the next edition of the model codes is certainly a way to continue to move forward and progress. I think also at a state and local level, engaging in the local code adoption process, to bring that consistency to the front and say, we operate in multiple states or multiple communities, and consistency and regular updates to codes allow technology to enter the process, provides that scalability and predictability across various different jurisdictions. So I think being involved and engaged in the code development and adoption process is certainly a key area as well. I think particularly for organizations that are engaged in the finance and insurance space, I think that's an opportunity where additional engagement would be incredibly valuable. Having sort of that financial aspect of why codes are important and how you're protecting the assets that you're investing in and providing financing for is really a key component as well.
Fannie Mae's multifamily team did a study not long ago, I believe, that kind of bore out some of the cost efficiencies that you got designing multifamily in a modular fashion, in an off-site design fashion. I'm not aware of anything similar, at least sustained on the single-family side. Starting with Greg, can you talk a little bit about why multifamily is such a great proving ground for some of these technologies, and what's really been easy to adopt in that space?
I think, multifamily kind of has built-in scale. When you're doing single family, are you doing all from a catalog of homes, or are you trying to scale by doing a lot of essentially the same model or a very small pool of models? I think multifamily market is so big, and essentially you can pursue only that in a specific geography, and that could keep your company busy for decades. The single-family home is harder to crack. That's why there are almost no, if you read Dwell magazine, prefab modern homes that are produced in a factory using a lot of automation in the entire United States, which to me is surprising compared to Sweden, where it reached 50% market share in the 1950s, and now it's 80%. So the question I bring is, where are the economies of scale? Why isn't this happening? How do you take the risk, and how do you capitalize that? We're kind of doing both right now. Even though we're small, we're doing both the multifamily and we're doing the single-family home. But I think we have to do more standardization in order to scale.
Molly?
I think it is the scale question, and the per unit cost of multifamily is lower. The investment, field of the folks that are putting capital into multifamily right now is significant. Capital flows into the space have been very large. There's a lot of lending out there, and so from a capital markets perspective, it's also a very interesting space. But mainly, I think it's the ability to achieve scale on one site in a small area with lower horizontal infrastructure cost.
Yeah, to Greg's point, there are a lot of different solutions here, and there's not a single solution to housing. For multifamily, I believe that kind of big box modular probably is the right approach. because you can take this same box and stack it and kind of repeat it over and over again. And I think that does make sense. I think big box modular makes less sense in the single family home space. And that's really that's the nut that we're trying to crack, and we're starting with backyard cottages because they're relatively simple, easy to execute, and we're going to use that same system and take it to to single family. The way we get there is we've got a standard kind of panel system that we use in 2-foot increments, and we just repeat that over and over again. We have few cladding options. We're not giving our customers infinite design options, but we're giving them when you can basically work with straight lines and 90-degree angles, change your cladding, have some interior finish options. You can do a lot of customization without it being kind of traditionally custom. So that's how we get there, is by not repeating the box, but repeating the system, these panels over and over again, and putting some variability around that.
How do we get into the single family space? I mean, just to pick up on that thread, Ford and GM can produce, have been for over a century producing cars for average people. How does that translate to the housing sectors, in particular the single family space? Because what I'm hearing here is if the single family space can't adopt, you have real questions about how sustainable that building model is, at least in keeping up with our country's needs.
I think we can. I think we can go after the single-family space, and if we don't, it's going to happen anyway. Sekisui, out of Japan, has fabricated 2.4 million homes. They're going to enter the U.S. market very aggressively in January. IKEA is working with Skanska. They've built 11,000. They're only in Europe. They're not in the U.S. yet, but they're doing very affordable homes. Lend-Lease has a $100 billion pipeline. That's an Australian company. They're doing amazing things. They just signed a contract with Google for $15 billion in the Bay Area, and they're doing many thousands of homes. I think there's room for companies at that size that are obviously extremely well capitalized, and there's room for small niche players, specifically because the market is so wildly inefficient. I, as a builder, originally got into building systems because I wanted to build more homes. I can't clone myself. We had a shortage of labor. The only way to really raise productivity is by building systems. We can produce more homes and raise productivity for workers, or even builders like me who want to build a lot of homes, but I do need a system in order to do that.
Yeah, the single family space, I think, just happens to lag given the scale issues and some of the financing issues around just the way that single family builders build today and how efficient they are in terms of cost. But that is definitely a space that I think will continue to see advances and more use of off-site construction technologies.
Starting with Don, what do you see the role of large institutions, whether it be Microsoft, Fannie Mae, whomever, in facilitating this, creating the conditions for it to be successful, helping you get to that breakout point where you can start to realize some of the promise that we've been talking about today?
Yeah, I mean, I think the obvious answer there is around financing. So Fannie Mae, obviously, with financing, and it's one of the, getting back, just kind of diving into the detail of what we do. The pain point for us is, we're building backyard cottages right now, and it's kind of becoming a big market on the West Coast because of needs for housing density and just not having enough land in major cities, right? The issue that we run into is it's a new asset class, and there's not really a product for this. And there is kind of technically a product out there, but there's not comps. So we've got kind of this chicken and egg problem, just thinking about kind of the Fannie and Freddie products that are out there right now. And then thinking about, the larger corporates like the Googles and the Apples, who have all recently announced a lot of new money going into this space. A financing product that's dedicated to, I think, different parts of the market would be really helpful. And it's not just, we have to have multifamily, we have to have more single family, we have to have ADUs as well. And those are all parts of the mix. So how do they bring their kind of financial muscle to bear on kind of financing these different segments of the market?
Ryan, how should institutions like Fannie Mae, who don't touch the primary market, don't touch the building market directly, how should we think about partnering with groups such as yourself in trying to help this out?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are certainly opportunities to provide consistency, particularly through setting requirements, say, minimum level requirements for new construction, for the financing that Fannie Mae deals with. I mean, I think that's certainly an opportunity. Creating a voice for the opportunities around resilience and protecting the investments that Fannie Mae makes within mortgages would be certainly valuable as well. And then engaging your partners from the financial institutions to recognize that if somebody's going to have a 30-year mortgage, the opportunities or the potential for hazard risk during that time frame is pretty significant in a lot of areas. And so protecting that investment over that time frame would be incredibly valuable. And things like building codes certainly support that effort.
Last question, because we are running out of time, so I'll start with Molly and go around the panel. You could wave a magic wand and remove one hurdle tomorrow to get everything you want. What would it be?
Universal zoning, so same code everywhere.
I would second that.
Yeah, national housing code.
If I could wave a magic wand, I would have the Seattle technology industry come to the table with the innovators in the building industry and essentially say, we have a unique opportunity here just to get these industries to collaborate using technology to build building systems. That wouldn't even require funding. Just to get the groups to the same table would be a major accomplishment.
Well, that's it. We're out of time. Long way to go, but it sounds like we're off to a tremendous start. Greg, Molly, Brian, Don, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.